Welcome to my Phase 7 Mage Guide for Season of Discovery. We got a lot to cover, so let's just jump right into it. To start things off, let's talk about the Mage Healer. For Talents and Runes, we have two builds that we can play this phase. We have the Arcane build, and we have the Frost build. The Arcane Talents and Runes are pretty standard stuff, nothing too crazy here. The only thing you can really move around here is going to be the 10 points in the Fire Tree. Not too many other points are really going to benefit that Arcane Spell School. The only thing I don't recommend taking is Improved Counterspell. If you get mind controlled on KT, for example, you have a chance of silencing one of your healers, which you don't want to do. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say about that. Runes, pretty standard stuff here. Arcane Barrage, Arcane Blast, Rewind Time. If you want, you can use Molten Armor instead, but that's pretty much the only thing to move around. For the Frost talents, pretty standard stuff, picking up Cold Snap, Winter's Chill, but for this build, we're going to be going into Ignite since we'll be using Balefire Bolt. Balefire Bolt is such a great spell as you can use this to get Ignite damage, stack Winter's Chill, and also heal your Temporal Beacon target. For runes, standard stuff again, pretty much the same as the previous phase, except now we're using Balefire Bolt. And if you don't want to use Balefire Bolt, here's an alternate build that uses Molten Armor and Brain Freeze, and takes the points out of fire and puts them into the Arcane Tree. And so the TLDR on what spec to play either of the three specs that I showed you. All of them will do very similar numbers in terms of healing. The only real difference is the Frost spec is going to do more DPS and bring Winter's Chill. The only downside of the Frost spec is you do want to have that 5-piece CG set bonus, or you're not going to see that full potential that it has. It's worth mentioning you can change to the Cryomancer Shoulder Rune to somewhat play around this. This will give you the 5-piece set bonus, but I don't really recommend running this as Eternal Caretaker is going to be much more mana efficient and much better in terms of healing. Moving on to the DPS builds, first up we have the Spellfrost build. Pretty standard talents, not too much to really talk about here. Making sure we pick up Cold Snap and Winter's Chill, and then of course running Spellfrost Bolt Rune to synergize with the talents. The next build we're going to talk about is the Frostfire build, pretty similar to what we just looked at, picking up Cold Snap and Winter's Chill, but this time we're going to be picking up Ignite and then moving over that rune to Frostfire Bolt. Out of the two specs, I recommend playing Frostfire as it will yield higher DPS. And then for the Fire build, we're going to be using these talents and runes. You may notice we only have 1 point out of 3 into Scorch. We'll be going into that later when we talk about the rotation. We also have 4 points into Shatter. This is for when we have our 6-piece set bonus, as it will benefit from the Shatter talent. Until you have your 6-piece, here's an alternate build for the meantime. But for runes this phase, we'll be using Enlightenment instead of Burnout. And of course, if you don't want to use Balefire Bolt, you can always swap to Molten Armor, spam Frostfire Bolt, and you will get similar DPS. For gearing, I'll leave a link to all the best in slot lists in the description below. These links will contain the talents, runes, and that best in slot gear for all the specs we previously talked about. If any of this information is to change, I'll be sure to update these and keep them relevant throughout the phase. If you have any questions on the gearing process or how to use the SEM, feel free to reach out to me on Discord. I'd be happy to help you out. For macros and weak auras, I'll leave a link to my Discord that contains everything I currently use. And anything I add in the future, I'll be sure to share that as well. 2 macros I recommend in all of my mage videos is going to be the cooldown macro and the mana gem macro. The cooldown macro will pop all of your CDs and continue casting that primary rotation. Just change the line where it says cast Spellfrost Bolt to whatever spell you're currently using and you're good to go. Same thing for the mana gem macro. This will pop the highest ranked mana gem you have and continue casting that primary spell. The reason we're doing this is so we're not individually pressing each of those buttons. By doing so, you will close the gaps between your inputs, and this will slowly add up over time if you're not using a macro like this. Now that we got that covered, let's talk about rotation. For the Arcane Mage Healer, we're going to precast Mastery Gen on whatever groups we're going to be healing, popping our cooldowns, and then casting Arcane Barrage for some instant healing. Following that, we're going to go into a filler rotation in a priority list kind of follows, casting Arcane Blast, reapplying Mastery Gen when needed, and then anytime you get a Missile Barrage proc, you're always going to prioritize using Arcane Missiles before any of your other spells. And that's pretty much the rotation. Just make sure that you're never going over more than 2 Arcane Blast stacks. If you are, cast Arcane Barrage to reset your stack so you're not running out of mana. And as a healer, you should always be looking to rotate your runes depending on what encounter you're going into. Fights like Patchwork and Mayexna, I highly recommend using Rewind Time, as when they enrage, you could really save your group if you're running that rune. Since all 3 Frost specs follow a similar rotation, I'll be covering all 3 together. The only differences will be the healer is going to use Mastery Gen accordingly whenever they need it, and then using Frostfire Bolt or Spellfrost Bolt depending on what spec you're playing. And make sure to use Ice Armor if you're playing Frostfire Bolt. Other than that, the rotation is identical. So on the pull, precast Evocation to get benefit from that 2-piece set bonus. If you have the Staff of Rime, you can choose to cast Ice Barrier and then swap weapons back to your primary weapon. Pop all your cooldowns and cast Frozen Orb. During this time, you can choose to cast Deep Freeze, but I recommend just going straight into that filler rotation of casting Frostfire Bolt. Other than that, just make sure to use your Ice Lance whenever you have at least 3 or 4 stacks of Glaciate. When the boss reaches around 30% HP, use Balefire Bolt to try to roll an Ignite, for when the boss reaches that 20% HP mark, your Ignite will no longer decay. After you cast your 4 Balefire Bolts, you'll continue casting Ice Lance for the remainder of the fight. And as a reminder, if you are healing, be sure to keep refreshing that mass regen so that it doesn't fall off of the group that you're healing. For the fire rotation, precast Evocation to get benefit from that 2-piece set bonus. Next, we're going to precast a Scorch into Living Bomb as well as casting Fire Blast. With the way that Scorch works now, you can cast a Living Bomb, and after its full duration, assuming that it doesn't get resisted when it explodes, you will have a 5 stack of Scorch, even if you have 1 point into improved Scorch. After that, we're going to pop our CDs, cast Frostfire Bolt, and then once we have 5 stacks of Scorch, we can go ahead and cast Balefire Bolt. On the second cast of Balefire Bolt, we're going to pop Combustion to get maximum benefit from those last 3 casts. After that, it's pretty much a filler rotation, casting Fire Blast on CD, using our Hot Streak procs on Pyroblast, and then reapplying Living Bomb if Scorch is going to fall off. Since we're using Enlightenment, try to keep your mana above 70% to take advantage of that extra 10% damage. Throughout each boss fight, try and Mana Pot and Mana Gem as early as possible. And something I didn't mention quite yet is on Thaddeus and Loatheb, you're going to want to wait to pop your cooldowns. On Loatheb, waiting until you get your Spore buff, and on Thaddeus, waiting until you get your positive or negative charge. By waiting for these damage modifiers, you're going to get so much more value from your cooldowns. As always, try and cast something instant if you ever have to move. On Maexna, for example, if you're about to get stunned, same thing applies here. Try and cast something instant like Fire Blast, Living Bomb, Arcane Barrage, or even a Deep Freeze. This will give you a little bit more DPS and will slowly add up over time. And then for the AoE rotation, this is just focused on your trash damage. You're going to follow this priority list, using Frozen Orb on cooldown, using Blast Wave on cooldown, casting Living Bomb on any target that's going to get the full duration. Following that, you're going to use Arcane Explosion as a filler. And then on the really big pulls, you can cast Flame Strike, but only if the targets are not going to move. Last thing to mention is if you're playing Frost, make sure to use Ice Lance and Cone of Cold on any targets that go below 20% health. Just like your single target rotation, you're going to follow this on trash as well. For buffs and consumes, we'll be using our major mana potions, demonic runes or dark runes. Just be aware that they do share a cooldown with your mana gem. We'll be using the Flask of Ancient Knowledge, and then for weapon imbues, we'll be using the Blessed Wizard Oil for any undead fights, and any fights that are not undead, we'll be using the Enchanted Repellent. For food buffs, we'll be using the Dark Claw Bisque, and then you could choose to use the Elixir of Fortitude for an extra 120 health. For elixirs, we'll be using the Elixir of the Mage Lord, Greater Firepower, Frost Power, and then the Mage Blood Potion. For miscellaneous, we'll be using our highest rank of the Seal of the Dawn, our Blasted Lance buff for an additional 25 int. This does stack with your Arcane Intellect. And then if you have any Mage Scrolls, be sure to use those to really maximize your damage. And then of course, make sure you're using your Profession consumes like the Scrolls from Enchanting, and then the Potions from Alchemy. Same thing goes for Engineering. Make sure that you're using your Sappers or any other explosives. You can of course use Stratham Holy Water, as this is really good inside of Naxxramas. And the rest goes without saying, but make sure that you have all your debuffs within your raid, bringing all of the world buffs that you can, and make sure you have all your buffs before the pull, including your Mage Armor, Ice Armor, or Molten Armor, depending on what spec you're playing. And then lastly, if you have any Innervates or PIs assigned to you, set up a Whisper macro so you can get these efficiently. And that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed this mage guide, I'll be making more in the future phases of Season of Discovery. So be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss when I post that video. Comment down below if you have any questions. And as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.